Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another Hypeimmune Reviews. I'm Schoolwriter and today we're going to talk about The Picture of Dorian Gray, the most famous, controversial and long-lasting work of the equally controversial Oscar Wilde. The Picture of Dorian Gray is also his only novel. Its creation already has quite an interesting and convoluted story, and its fame reached an apex in the 80s, far after its creator's death. Sadly, nowadays it's mostly waned, but it's still there. I read it once when I was younger and now I've read it again, this time without any nostalgia goggles, and after having read more of Wilde's materials. How did it fare? The Picture of Dorian Gray is, well, a rather famous story of Dorian Gray and his picture. End of story. Okay. Basically, The Picture of Dorian Gray was a novel written by Oscar Wilde. The idea for the novel came from a portrait of the author painted by Francis Richards in 1887. In 1889, G. M. Stoddart, an editor for Lipton's monthly magazine, had a dinner with Oscar Wilde, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, yes, that Conan Doyle, and T. P. Gill, to commission novellas, and thus was born The Portrait of Mr. W. H., the prototype of The Picture of Dorian Gray. The novel per se was finally launched 1 year later and immediately went through censorship without the author's knowledge due to gentlemen feeling that a dude being in love with another dude was icky and barbaric. This led Wilde to retool and expand the novel, and in 1891 the version most people know was launched, only to be immediately critically panned, regarded as immoral, indecent, and that Wilde should be persecuted for violating public morality laws. So yeah, you can already see that this novel is good. Wilde defended his novel tooth and nail, but only in modern times, more or less in the 80s, that public view started appreciating his work. This is the story of Dorian Gray, an adolescent gentleman in England whose beauty and purity were such that the painter Basil Hallward, enamored with Dorian, paints his portrait. Before completing said portrait, Basil receives the visit of a friend of his, Lord Henry, a notorious decadent dandy with several ideas about hedonism. Henry gets interested in Gray's purity, and much to Basil's chagrin and against his wishes, meets the adolescent and starts to talk about his decadent ideas with him, about how his youth is precious and shall be gone soon. And upon the completion of the portrait, which ends being Basil's masterpiece, Dorian wishes that the portrait would be the one to age while his beauty would be preserved. Later, he discovers that his wish was indeed granted, and that effectively he has carte blanche to do anything he wants, for all the effects of his corruption will be thrown into the picture. I'm aware of Oscar Wilde's style. Not only I've read his book once, but I've also read The Happy Prince and his other tales, which honestly I love it as much as it was heart-wrenching. Rereading it made me aware of the jarring style changes. The story is told in third person, and quite interestingly, which will be further developed in Cohesion, Wilde chooses to be scant in details about people. Yes, in a novel about how teenagers is absurdly beautiful, the brunt of the descriptions go to the scenarios, attires and objects. And those are really good. From time to time there are some tiny details about a character, like how Lord Henry's beard is brown or Dorian's eyes, but not much besides that. There is a sense of beauty and poetry in the scenarios and revulsion in the decadent ones. The details about attires and pictures are precise to inspire awe. And yet I barely know how Lord Henry and Basil, two of the most important characters of the whole novel, look and dress. Gray himself just gets a bit more description than the others, and even then it's just details as if he was indeed a picture. For example, in the center of the room, clamped to an upright easel, stood the full-length portrait of a young man of extraordinary personal beauty, and in front of it, Some little distance away was sitting the artist himself, Basil Hallward, whose sudden disappearance some years ago caused at the time such public excitement and gave rise to so many strange conjectures. As the painter looked at the gracious and comely form he had so skilfully mirrored in his art, a smile of pleasure passed across his face, and seemed about to linger there. But he suddenly started up, and closing his eyes, placed his fingers upon the lids, as though he sought to imprison within his brain some curious dream from which he feared he might awake. An interesting trick that Wilde uses through the novel is that he explains in detail a specific idea, no matter how decadent, depraved, and immoral, playing it as if it was indeed good and seductive even, writing as if it was the author himself explaining his personal thoughts, only to twist it at the last second and reveal that it was a specific character that thinks it, more often than not, Gray and sometimes Henry. I sincerely love it. It keeps the reader on his toes, pondering and chewing said ideas, nearly agreeing it with its finer points, or disagreeing, only to show who's the seducer and thus recontextualizing the whole thing. Personally, I do think that the lack of descriptions of characters is a bit detrimental, especially in a novel about beauty and youth. And there's a lack of Wilde's bittersweet romantic fantasy of the happy prince, although I understand that such wouldn't be overly fitting, but more into Cohesion. The story per se is pretty straightforward. It's divided into chapters without specific titles, time is linear featuring some time jumps, and while the novel features detailed descriptions, is arguably short, so there shouldn't be many problems reading it. The immersion due to the writer's style is an interesting topic, since Wilde focuses on every single visual aspect other than the characters themselves. I felt that the whole book was something akin describing a theater play rather than a novel. As in, he was instructing how the sets, clothes, and objects should look like and let any actor or actress slip into the characters. While Gray needs a specific type of actor, anyone could be Basil or Henry. To me, the immersion took a hit, but I'm well aware that the response for this middle-of-the-road approach would depend on personal tastes. While most of the novel is focusing on delivering a rather complex set of themes, I ended the book feeling that there were some parts of it that could be developed further. Characters used more and given bigger depth. Being a writer of short stories myself, who is now working on novels, I understand the difficulty and hurdles that transitioning between genres entails. After all, Wilde wrote fairy tales before hopping into his only novel. But I do agree that it could have used a bit more time in the oven. Poor Basil, who is vital to the story, barely appears in it. Speaking of Basil, I also understand that my point of view is tainted by being a dude in the 21st century, but I'm impressed that all that it took for the book to be published were the censorship of 500 words, including a phrase blatantly saying that Basil loved another man. That's because even without that, this book is really, really gay. It's gayer than a rainbow-studded diamond. It doesn't reach Grappler Baki or JoJo levels of gayness, but it's still pretty gay, and nothing's gayer than JoJo. Basil is absolutely head over heels for Gray. Hell, he even confesses such to Henry. It's almost explicit that Dorian went after other men as well. What will also depend on personal tastes is the rhythm. Since Wilde uses a lot of parties and social events to expose his ideas and themes, there's a lot of dialogues and exposition of thoughts and behaviors. I didn't feel that he took overly long with them, but those who like more straightforward stories may find themselves a bit bored, and these passages are quite important because they expose the This is one of those rare novels that the more you read into it, more you find to talk about. While it dances the edge between being purposefully vague and exposed just enough to give food for thought, showing what specific characters do and think, but utterly refusing in explaining too much, letting the readers reach their own conclusions. Most of the time, themes are shown, not told. For example, you've seen that Lord Henry is a gigantic asshole because he is relentlessly acting as such towards other people, no matter the situation, instead of being told, Lord Henry, I like it to act like a jackass in order to rile people. But Wilde understandably sometimes switches gears and explains to us specific ideas from specific characters in order to make a point, as exposed in Coherence, such as Lord Henry had a special interest in seeing how a pure creature like Dorian would react to his ideas. To me, the themes of this book center around corruption and free will. Every time a character influences another, there's a visible tug-of-war between the corruptor and the corrupted. The questions are asked about how much of a blame lies in every party. Moral corruption isn't just presented in one character influencing another, for ideas can be also transmitted through objects such as books, or imposed by a decadent society that uses its wealth in search of the next big thing. And if this novel lacks the beautiful sadness of the Hypeimmune Prince and other tales, it replaces it with a lot of acid and poison. Wilde is relentlessly in showing, not telling, how the elites are enamored with the concept of decadence and cheap thrills, some moments even reaching black comedy levels. And then he doubles down and tells about the paths that were behind the parties, the misery of those that society decided to skew, the city's underbelly and the opium den where many of said elites go in search of even more decadent relief, and where many of Gray's victims ended. Thus, he paints a rather interestingly complex scenario. Beautiful attires, places, and objects are handled mostly by people who are morally decadent and given them all, but passing all. There is a tragic waste of something fleeting, but not for the commonly known reasons, and the author asks again and again how much a man is responsible for resisting corruption, and how much is inevitable in face of an overwhelming power. Unsurprisingly, this is the kind of novel where characters are the backbone of the story itself, nothing moves without them. This may seem redundant to say, but from time to time it's worthy reminding the audience there are several stories where the characters merely react to the plot instead of guiding it, and some where they actually act completely opposite to the plot or independent of the plot itself. Not here though. The relationships of influence and their reactions are the plot itself, so characterization is the cogs that move them. Like stated before, this is the sort of story that the more you read into it, more is discovered. And while it shows, doesn't tell, what characters do, at least for the most part. This leaves a lot to be discussed between readers and thus is subject to personal interpretation. Dorian Gray is a beautiful but immature and naive dandy, and thus helpless to prevent Henry from corrupting him, but at the same time he doesn't seek other venues or opinions. Not only he allows, and I say allows lightly because this is up to debate, Henry's words to take root in him, not heeding to baseless plea, but he dives headfirst into depths of depravity only allowed to him because of his perennial youth and beauty. Henry may have corrupted him with ideas and words, but the damage that we see Dorian inflicting on others by corrupting them is hundreds, if not thousands of times worse. Is Henry directly responsible for all this misery? Dorian leads several people to tragic deaths, telling others and the reader that said people could have dropped off his influence any time they wanted, only for the narrative to emphasize his beauty and magnetic charm. Is it true? Could they have shaken his influence off? Could he have shaken Henry's influence off? If yes or no, why? What's the difference between honeyed words and undying beauty and charm? He is an interesting character to analyze and recontextualize due to how he is presented, and much is subjected to interpretation. He is always seeking new things, new people, diving into them headfirst to dropping them like old toys later. Is he aware of the damage he inflicts on them? Things get more complex when not only his actions are exposed, but society's reactions to them. The more depraved and damaging he gets, the more the high society wants him and can't drop him. The upper cream of English society keeps seeking him for advice, while he wants to be something more, an ideal. Is he a mirror to society itself? Dorian has virtually carte blanche to do everything he wants, so why does he choose depravity specifically? A completely, absolutely personal interpretation that I have is that there are also brushes and touches of a man that never really grew up. With age comes the end of physical beauty, yes, but also wisdom. But something that may shut down my own interpretation is that Lord Henry also gets older, but not wiser. At the end of the novel, did Dorian change? Were his attempts at change genuine that came at the wrong moment, or desperation of a child that doesn't want to face the repercussions? How much did Lord Henry's ideas corrupted him? Or did they simply brought up pieces of a personality buried by a harsh upbringing and environment that invites and celebrates decadence? We may never know. Fun fact, I know some people like Lord Henry. People like him are an interesting and useful kind of asshole friend to have. But only if you keep several precautions and never ever let your guard down. You need the maturity to take everything that they say with not only a grain of salt, but 2 tons of it. Because by the end of the day, this kind of friend is an asshole that deserves to be punched sometimes, but by themselves isn't a criminal, just an asshole that can discuss virtually any topic due to their high intelligence and whose keen sense of observation brings several valuable insights about society. But like Lord Henry, they are delightful morons that will miss things happening right under their noses. Henry's offers good ideas to mull, but not to delve into, and can act like an antagonist, the Greek kind, to put philosophical musings to the test. An intelligent idiot. Ergo, he is like poison, but lacks the malice of a murderer. Just 1 drop of it and you can make all sorts of antidotes and medicines, but a bit too much and you'll be dooming yourself. The novel expresses this on how Henry and Basil are still friends even though both of them have completely opposite points of view. And every time Henry tries his decadent talks with Basil, the painter just dismisses his bullshit. Basil downright exposes him in their very first scene together. You are an extraordinary fellow. You never say a moral thing, and you never do a wrong thing. Your cynicism is simply a pose. Mother Fraga called him a poser, and he's right, which also brings up questions about damages of posers. But back at the review. Basil himself is actually quite aware of Henry's problems and asks him not to talk with Dorian, which sadly ends up doing the reverse and kickstarts the whole plot. Henry tries an experiment with Dorian, who doesn't heed to Basil's warnings, filling him with ideas about decadence, not because he hates Grey, not because he wants Grey for himself, but rather he just wants to see what would happen, like an idiot. And sadly he never realizes how far Grey has gone. In fact, he's such an idiot that when presented with proof of Dorian's deeds, he dismisses them. Lastly, Basil is a purist and acts as such. There is purity in Dorian that should be kept immaculate as long as possible, and that people can lead pure lives. Or at least he thinks so. Just like he thinks that his love for Grey is as pure as the teenager. He is the fastest and the sharpest of the protagonists to see the simplicity beneath the decadence complexity and Lord Henry's bullshit. But he also knows his role within society and how he must at least behave in order to live with others. Sadly, while he is perceptive enough to know that something happened, and tragically see his love waning and crumbling, Basil's adulation mixed with his isolation from society blinds him to the sheer size of Grey's corruption and descent into depravity, Also preferring to see the good in people led him to a rather precarious position where distance should have been the preferred alternative. I really like this novel. I understand that it could have been better, with Wilde's experience on shorter stories and his interest in theatre leaving gaps on this novel's structure. But just the point where the themes about corruption and decadence are ingrained with the written style itself, as if Wilde wanted to corrupt the reader, the show don't tell would be enough to ensure our recommendation. But this novel goes beyond, making a small web of twists and pulls exposing how society craves what it claims to abhor, and even the most depraved person can be idolized if they have enough beauty and charisma. So yes, I absolutely recommend it. While due to the style, focusing on dialogues and descriptions of scenarios, it won't be for everyone, but this is an interesting novel to read, especially to talk about with friends. See you all next time and thank you for coming. It does feel a bit cheap saving Dorian from certain death without a confrontation, only to kill him immediately afterwards. I know that this is to show that he was a victim of his own vanity, but there could be better ways of getting rid of the sailor who went after him only to die to an accident. The morbid humor about how people care more about their own feelings rather than the fact that an innocent man was killed in a hunting accident was delightful though. I've seen people decry that Lord Henry deserved a fate worse than just having his wife leave him and him bemoaning his old age. And I agree up to a point. While certainly he deserved more for his influence on Dorian, I didn't see him going away scot-free like some people said. I felt that the novel indicated very well that Henry would end up pretty much like his uncle, a lone, miserable grouch loved by all and only visited when relatives needed money. And he lost Dorian, the only person who kept listening to his decadent ideas. It does also sadly reflect how idiots won't see the error of their ways. See you all next time and thank you.